The temporal bone is the bone on the side of the skull that corresponds with where your ear, your auricle, connects with the outside of your head. And so it is surrounded by these squiggly lines that the stick is following. And we'll go over many features on it. And before I get too far ahead, here is the temporal bone disarticulated and all by itself. So we'll look at that as well to look at some of the features. The squamous suture is the suture that connects the the temporal bone to the parietal bones above it. And it's called that, even though it is curved over the top of the bone, it's called the squamous suture because this region of the bone that I'm tracing with the tip of the stick is very flat, and it corresponds with where your ear is connected. But this region of the bone is called the squamous part. And so the squamous suture is just above the squamous part of the temporal bone. And then there are several projections that stick out of the temporal bone. The first is called the mastoid process, and I've got the tip of the stick touching this mastoid process. Mastoid means shaped like a breast. A mastectomy is the removal of breast tissue. So mastoid is this rounded bump, and the mastoid process is just directly behind your earlobe, so you can feel that bony projection of the mastoid process just behind your earlobe, which hangs right about there. The styloid process is broken off. You can see the remaining edge of where it broke off here. But the styloid process is a very pointed projection. So if we look at this individual bone, here's the mastoid process, very rounded projection, and then here's the styloid process, quite long and pointed, kind of reminds me of a predator's canine tooth, right? Styloid process. Then the zygomatic process is a little easier to wrap your head around when you look at this individual bone as well. The zygomatic bone is one of your facial bones, and there's a pattern in the skull where, and other places really, where a projection is sometimes named for the bone that it articulates with. And this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Almost looks like, especially since your ear is right here, almost looks like this bone has a Bluetooth device in its ear. The zygomatic process is called that because it's a projection that reaches out and articulates with the zygomatic bone in front of it. And so if we go back to the articulated skull, here is the zygomatic process. Here's the squiggly line. That means there's a suture and a joint there. And this is the zygomatic bone. It's your cheekbone of the face. Okay, so the zygomatic process of the temporal bone is the projection that reaches out and touches the zygomatic bone. And so I recommend that you study it by practicing the zygomatic process of the temporal bone so that you keep straight which process goes with which bone. The external acoustic meatus, or external auditory canal, is your ear hole on the outside of the skull. So I've got the stick going into that. And if I was cleaning my ear with a Q-tip, I would be putting the Q-tip into this area that's covered by tissue. This is your ear hole. Okay? Then we start to look inside a superior view down into the top of the skull. And if I put the stick, for orientation purposes, I'm putting the stick into the external acoustic meatus, and then I'm kind of looking at it straight on. If I tap that stick, it's going to tap this ridge. There are sort of two shelves where the very base of your skull kind of comes up to a second level here and then a third level up here. This posterior most shelf inside the skull is a region of the temporal bone. You can see the outline of the temporal bone that I'm sort of tracing with the tip of the stick. This ridge that's within the middle of the temporal bone is called the petrous part. And petrous means rocky. So anatomists thought this looked like a Rocky Mountain ridge inside the skull. And the structures of hearing and equilibrium are embedded within the petrous part of this bone. So it makes sense that it's straight in and at the back of the external acoustic meatus. Okay, and then if I tilt this at an angle, you can see the dark mark where pencils have made an exaggerated shadow where there is an indentation in the cliff face, if you will, of the petrous part mountain range. This is the internal acoustic meatus. And if I had two sticks, I would really be able to show you that the internal and the external acoustic meatus are lined up with each other. Okay? But the internal acoustic meatus is on the cliff face, on the inside of the skull, on the cliff face of the petrous part. And directly below that, if I angle this just right, especially if I put something, especially if I were to put something with a slightly different color than the brown of my table below, but I can put this stick through an opening. It's a rather large sized opening that is directly inferior to the internal acoustic meatus. And this opening is shaped like a kidney bean, and it is the jugular foramen. So the jugular foramen is very visible here. And if I put the stick through it, and then I turn the skull over to look at the inferior view, we can also see that jugular foramen, and it's a little easier to see that kidney bean shape from this angle, the jugular foramen there. It's almost an opening between where the temporal bone is articulating with the occipital bone. Okay, so near the foramen magnum as well. And then from this angle, the carotid canal is an indentation in most of the plastic skull models that is directly anterior to that jugular foramen. So here's the large opening of the jugular foramen that I'm putting the stick down into now. And the carotid canal looks like an indentation. In a real skull, this indentation is a passageway that has several turns within it, which means that on the plastic skulls, they're really only representing the first part of the tunnel, if you will. But it's directly anterior, so closer to the teeth and the face, from the jugular foramen. And keep in mind that there are a bunch of openings in the skull that we are not learning, that are not listed in the lab manual. Okay, and then the last feature of the temporal bone, and then I'll go back over some of these on the disarticulated bone, is the mandibular fossa. And the mandibular fossa is a shallow depression. If I was super desperate to drink water and this is all I had, this might be a good place, although there likely would be others. But the mandibular fossa corresponds with where the mandible, which is your lower jaw, articulates with the skull just directly by your ear. So if you put your finger right in front of your ear hole, which is the external acoustic meatus, if you put your finger just directly anterior to that and you open and close your mouth, you can feel this temporomandibular joint, some people refer to as TMJ, and there's sort of a condition of that joint with that name. The mandibular fossa is the shallow depression in the temporal bone that is meant to receive the condyle of the mandible. So we'll look at some of those features again on the disarticulated temporal bone. Again, it looks quite odd, lots of projections coming out of it. So the squamous suture would be the joint that corresponds with this top edge of the bone and where it connects with the parietal bones. The squamous part is the flat region of the bone right below the squamous suture. The mastoid process is the rounded projection Styloid process is the pointed projection. External acoustic meatus is your ear hole, this large indentation kind of right next to the mastoid and styloid processes. Then you come forward, and this large projection at the anterior portion of the bone that looks like a Bluetooth device sticking out of the ear is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Then we come to an interior view, and the petrous part is this ridge on the inside. The internal acoustic meatus is the indentation directly below that. Then the jugular foramen is going to be the opening that is directly below that. So on this bone, we really only see part of that opening because it's really the opening between, in this specific region, but between the temporal bone and the occipital bone. And then if we flip the skull over, we can find the carotid canal, which is just in front of where the jugular foramen is. And then the mandibular fossa, which here there's a little rubber indentation embedded within it that allows this skull to be put together. But this is the mandibular fossa, this smooth depression that would be just anterior to the external acoustic meatus.